The Demon God is on the brink of return, and the Umbral Lamp has found its way to you, the newest member of the Dark Crusaders. Will you rise to the challenge, or let the corrupted minions of Rogar consume you in darkness? My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today, after going hands-on with Lords of the Fallen, we're sharing our initial thoughts on the game. Lords of the Fallen is quickly becoming a late year 2023 surprise, with interest continuing to grow ahead of launch. Well, I've got some awesome news. Legacy Gaming has been going hands-on with the game, and we're able to share our first impressions a week ahead of launch. Both myself and Livid are avid fans of Souls games, and with recent titles like Lies of P and Remnant 2 fresh on our mind, we eagerly jumped at the chance to pick up the controller once again and save the world from evil. For the next few minutes, we'll be sharing our unvarnished thoughts of the game, with our experience stopping around the second boss. It's given us a lot of insight into what Lords of the Fallen brings to the table, where it excels, and where we see some potential problems. With that in mind, let's dive in. One of the first things we talked about in our Lords of the Fallen Ultimate Preview video was the game's use of Unreal Engine 5 and how that could essentially evolve the visual experience. Well, we were right on the money because the world of Mournstead looks absolutely incredible. Couple powerful technology with the team's strong environmental art direction, and you've got a game that really pays tribute and attempts to expand upon the foundation that FromSoft's Dark Souls established long ago. You know, one of the telltale signs of good art direction is not only the relationship between the enemies and the world, but also how the player interprets those things, and that really hits on two fronts. From the second you start your adventure, your eyes are just drawn all over the place as you try and take in this incredibly elaborate and dark world the team has created. Within that world are also enemies that are on theme and also immediately recognizable. Within the first few hours, you'll run across a half dozen or so enemies, and they all stand apart while still feeling like they belong in the world. Being able to quickly identify a threat and address it is a big deal in this type of game, and the team really seems to get that right. That's true in both Axiom, the Land of the Living, and Umbral, the Land of the Dead. And while Umbral is built around a very monochromatic color palette, the world is still insanely detailed and the enemies recognizable. To take this a step further, the two bosses we're allowed to show you just expand on what the game is already doing well. Pieta, the first boss you fight, and most likely an encounter you've already seen from previous beta tests, is a fun first fight and introduces you to the radiant side of the game, the holy magic attempting to keep the corruption at bay. It's the three themes, fantasy, torment, and dread, that are constantly in flux, and while we're only a few hours in, we've already got a taste for all of them. If the game continues to dance around that spectrum, it'll be fun to see how each of the themes presents itself in the enemies in the world alike. Truth be told, after about 10 hours with the game, the exploration and visual design of the world is what's kept us going. And even though we have some issues to talk about, it's important we acknowledge one of the strongest aspects of the game up front, because it's so integral to the theme. We're honestly just excited to see where this goes from here as we get deeper into the game, but we're cautiously optimistic this will remain a highlight of the Lords of the Fallen experience. Alright, so let's dive into the thing I think most Souls fans and even some casual followers of the game are really interested in learning more about, a fundamental system that defines so much of the gameplay experience in a Souls game: combat. We can't sugarcoat this, guys. It's our biggest single issue with the game. We're going to talk about why on different levels. First, attacks feel rigid. This is true of almost every enemy we've experienced up until this point. When you combine that with a number of mechanical movesets from enemies, you can almost feel the trigger instances that take the mob from a resting state to a combat state. That rigidness carries over to the player's actions, which are further exacerbated by the fact that you can't cancel animations, and the recovery time after a number of attacks is, in our opinion, far too long. It creates these very distinct windows of action and then delay that don't connect the moment-to-moment action, and it's noticeable right from the start. Counter to that is the movement and dodge mechanic, which feel floaty for lack of a better term. You move quickly, and the run speed is almost comical, but it's the evade that exposes this feeling the most. When you evade, and especially when you roll, the distance you cover is so great you almost disengage from your enemy, which often makes the combat experience disjointed, as that extra length disrupts the cadence of the action. If that was the end of the issues, okay, not so bad, but little things continue to compound on the baseline combat, and while we believe a lot of this can be fleshed out with more player feedback and a post-launch patch, it's important to call attention to something we know is so vitally important in a Souls game. One thing we found frustrating was the lack of consistency of how an enemy responded when hit with an attack. Sometimes they'd reel back, staggered for a few seconds. Other times you'd hit them and absolutely nothing would happen, and that might even cause a stray enemy attack to slip through, and early game, that's a big deal. Consistency is such a huge sticking point in combat. Good, bad, or otherwise, you can adjust to most tuning, but lack of consistency is really hard to account for. That same lack of consistency also trickles into the player's animations, especially when you string together moves. That disjointed experience I mentioned before really comes through in multi-hit combinations, and when that issue compounds with hit detection issues, compounded further by the lack of animation canceling, you're almost guaranteed to feel the pointy side of an enemy attack, and that doesn't feel great. That lack of consistency also impacts the dodging side of combat. Now, it's hard to put my finger on this one, but that iframe window never seemed to quite click in my head, and while you could absolutely say that's player error, both myself and Livid felt that same thing, and while we are two very different types of Souls players, to have that same experience and that same confusion around a critical system is a pain point. There's also something to be said about the almost artistic back and forth dance that FromSoft has mastered in their combat. Hexworks still has some growing to do on that front. Of the enemies that we fought, it was very rarely a true back and forth. Most times it was wait for an enemy to attack, dodge it, then strike, and that was the dance. There are a few tougher enemies that we faced that hinted at that sort of risk versus reward combat experience, but those moments were few and far between at this point in the game. To really cap it off, yes, there are bugs, and those bugs impacted a number of enemies. We ran into a handful of elite enemies that were trivialized because of the issues that broke their pathing or something else entirely, negating their impact on the experience. If you're someone curious about how magic works in the game, well, we really can't comment on that quite yet. I play an Orion Preacher, and my starting spell, a Holy Bolt, did some work in some tricky early game situations. I don't want to lead the witness here, and I think both myself and Livid want to explore magic more completely, which we'll cover in our full review ahead of launch. Now, combat is largely informed by the gear that you're using. We all know that, and here too, there are some cracks in the armor, mainly the lack of information. If you go into the character screen, which should look very familiar if you're coming over from a Dark Souls game, you'll quickly realize you can't get additional information on pretty much anything. I have a few hundred points in physical defense, but what does that mean? Is that good? Is that bad? Is that high? Low? How much damage mitigation does that equate to in a percentage? It's unclear, and lack of clarity here is not good. We can infer what stats like strength and agility do purely because it's in line with Dark Souls for the most part. They determine if you can wield X or Y weapon, and weapons have ratings in their stats so you know what they scale best with. However, once you have said stats though, you're kind of left wondering, okay, is my character in a good place? Needless to say, combat and the systems that feed into combat are currently the weakest part of the game, but keep in mind that this is just our first impressions, not a full review, and like I said earlier, a lot of what we've mentioned could be ironed out in a patch once the community raises those concerns or other concerns writ large. Being in a specific creator Discord with the developers, I can tell you they are genuinely interested in hearing player feedback, and hopefully they'll take action to address the community. Now, another core pillar of Lords of the Fallen is the concept of dual realities, that of Axiom and Umbral. Using your Umbral lamp, you're not only allowed to peer into the world of the dead, but you can flay your soul and enter Umbral proper and explore an entirely new realm. To be honest, this is a really refreshing take on a concept that has scarcely been used in modern games. The power of Unreal Engine 5 is really on display here because not only are you traveling in one realm, but you're actually in two at all times. Using your lamp to peer into another dimension has to be one of the coolest ways to explore a game world we've ever experienced, and quite frankly, it adds a layer to the exploration that just keeps things interesting. The contrast between Axiom and Umbral is staggering, but it's the introduction of additional elements in Umbral that help you navigate the world that are really the true secret sauce. With just a few hours of game time under our belts, it was clear Umbral wasn't going to be a gimmick. It's part of the gameplay experience, and while it's definitely the B-side to Axiom's A-side, you spend a lot of time there because often it's the only way you can progress through the world. Not only is Umbral necessary for progression, it also holds so much potential when it comes to secrets, and unless you hold up your lamp at all times, it's very possible you could be walking by something of value without ever knowing it. You'll come across platforms you can pull, bridges you can cross, and sometimes even gaps in a wall you'd never expect to be there, dumping out into large hidden areas. Even a large body of water in Axiom deceptively hides a whole area of the map within the Umbral realm. It's a very cool concept, and it's executed extremely well, but we do have one major concern. In the game, there's a system called Dread. While in Umbral, your dread rises, and the game will consistently send enemies after you, essentially hunting you down. This adds an entirely new dimension to the Souls experience, one that I don't think has ever been employed before. It means you constantly have to be on your guard in Umbral, and while that's fine, the lack of audio or visual cues to let you know enemies are quite literally spawning behind you can often lead to some really frustrating moments. The undead hunters have no consideration for what you're actively doing, whether that be fighting, solving a puzzle, or even just looking in your inventory, which can really pull you out of the moment. Umbral as a concept is superb, and the dual realities is just as impressive as we thought it was going to be ahead of going hands-on, but the never-ending assault of enemies does quickly wear you down, and while it starts slow, it does at times completely pull you out of that fun aspect of exploration that makes Souls games so special. When we put together our more formal, brutally honest reviews, we don't often comment on technicals. We want to tell you a cohesive story about our experience, and usually small audio issues and things like frame pops don't feel worth talking about. In this case, a first impression, with only a handful of hours under our belts, we think it's pretty important to point out some of those major things we experienced. Let's start with audio design. While not something that usually has any bearing on our experience with the game, we're talking about a Souls game here, and audio is a very crucial part of that gameplay experience. I'd wager a good number of you, whether you know it or not, use audio cues mid-combat when you play a Souls game. It's a vital part of the information gathering process, and in Lords of the Fallen, things feel all over the place. What it really boils down to is a lack of valuable and consistent sounds that enhance the experience. There are plenty of loud and complex sounds that make things sound impressive, but very little of that helps the player engage with the world around them, and oftentimes it's not properly mixed and localized. You could have an attack land 10 meters away, and it would sound like it's happening right in front of your face, and that lack of fall-off is jarring. Now, to be fair, this isn't going to impact everyone equally. Personally, I don't rely on audio cues as much as Livid does, for example, so our experience here are varied, but if you do rely on sound design to help you play these types of games, I think you're going to find that Lords of the Fallen is a bit of a letdown. Now, we all know stories in these types of games are murky, but if you are interested in the story, it's very clear, at least to us, that the range of voice talents is varied. Some characters are well voiced and suck you right into the incredible world with the tale that they're telling.
The lamp must be born until the favored child makes themselves known.
While others miss the mark entirely. If you're not picking up on a theme, it's consistency. There are moments of true epicness that really cement Lords of the Fallen as an immersive experience, but little things like a janky animation or a poorly performed voice line shake you right out of that moment. On the performance side of things, both myself and Livid noticed an immediate stutter in the opening animation, which was obviously a concern. DLSS did fix that issue, and once the game fully loaded, things were more or less smooth sailing, but we did notice some drop frames specifically in larger areas, which is something we'll be paying attention to come launch. Now, I'm running an NVIDIA rig while Livid is running an AMD setup, so we do cover the spectrum. We both experience those small hits in performance, so hopefully it's something the team can iron out. Outside of those issues and the small enemy AI performance problems we mentioned earlier, our experience has been solid, so that's a good sign heading into launch. I will say this game almost requires a controller, and while I know there are only a handful of mouse and keyboard Souls players out there, the introduction of new systems like the Umbral Lamp and even multi-hit attacks feels so much more natural on a gamepad. Lords of the Fallen is so close to capturing our hearts and minds fully, but there are some definite issues to the Souls formula that veterans of the genre will immediately notice if and when they pick up the game. The things that work are the exploration, artistic direction, and puzzle elements. The concept of dual realities feels fresh and adds such an interesting layer to the formula, albeit frustrating at times. It takes exploration, a core pillar of the genre, to a completely new place, and that's engaging. However, on the more critical side of things, combat just isn't quite there. I think we just need to admit we're spoiled by FromSoft, and if you accept Lords of the Fallen as something else entirely and try hard as it is, Not to compare it to Dark Souls, you'll have an easier time dealing with some of the issues we mentioned before. We don't want to be overly critical of a game we genuinely feel we haven't put enough time into yet, because Lords of the Fallen is by no means a bad game, but we are big sticklers on combat being satisfying and consistent, especially in this genre, and right now, the game in this aspect is lukewarm. That being said, we're soldiering on and we won't stop until Adir's corruption is purged from Mournstead, and that means a full review on launch day, as well as some additional content to help you get started on your journey in Lords of the Fallen. I want to thank Hexworks and CI Games for giving us the chance to speak candidly about their game, and as always, if you want more videos like this in your feed, you know what to do. Hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. Of course, you can also join us on Discord if you want to hang out with the team, talk about great games, and enter for your chance to win tons of free giveaways going on all the time. That link, as always, is below. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.